Whoopsie.
The upgrade in the AV equipment in this room was scheduled for last week.
Yeah.
And so,
Oh,
Yeah.
it's rescheduled.
yeah, we scheduled too far. Yeah,
That's why we have this thing.
yes, yeah, more reliable.
That's, oh yeah, 'cause we used the camera that's up on the wall up there, so that,
Well, it just was unpredictable.
Yeah, sure.
This- This works.
Yeah.
Reliable.
It's super helpful.
Working.
Eric brought it.
That's what.
sure, that's gorgeous.
We have that gallery and wait 7 minutes.
This is a taste of. It's like a place.
And the river center and. One of my trophy, I'm kind of. But I like nice stuff.
Who else were you expecting? I was in the lobby. Oh, okay, thank you. Yep. Heather, I think we're-
You doubt. Yes.
Are there more in the lobby, Steve?
Not right now. Might go back down.
Okay.
I called mine. They go. Should be all right, Steve.
I think we should go ahead and get started with introductions. I think most everyone's here. There might be one or two coming in. And I'm about to lose my voice, of course. I have to go get some water. But hi, everyone. Deb Myhoff, I'm the facilitator for EOA Collaborative Working Group, which you all are a part of. We will sort of outline the agenda here in a second. Let's just do introductions first. Thank you. And then we'll get going. Go ahead, Jimmy. I'm doing Michelle, I think.
Sign work.
Debbie Silva with Evraz Oregon Field Observing.
Tanya Hartnett, Executive Director of Working Environment Coalition.
Ellen Wax, outgoing director for Coalition. Darren Taylor, I for the Harbor Community Advisory Group and the Brady River.
Rose Longoria with the Acclamation.
And strong for bigger. Daniel Sobey, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Jeff Cottle, from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Or if you call yours, spilling coffee all over the place.
Good morning, BPS.
You could, yes.
Christy Allen from Commissioner Rubio's office.
Together, we're Patricia Deeper for Chief Planner here with Serving Sustainability.
And Tom Armstrong with BPS.
I'm Brett Warner, I'm with Portland Parks.
John Isaacson, the voice you hear outside.
Okay, John's on his way, but you're welcome. Okay, great. And then we have a couple of folks online. Could you, I don't know. Hang on one second. Maybe Steph, why don't you go
Sure,
first?
I'll go. Steph, Planning Commission. Sorry, I can't be there in person.
Great. And how about Kara?
Hi, Karen Nolan, CBRE.
Thank you. And Marie?
Marie Walkowitz, Bureau of Environmental Services.
Wonderful. Am I missing anyone? Oh, Susie.
And a meeting guest.
Oh, meeting guest might be Bob. I don't know what's coming up.
Susie?
Susie Lawson, consultant.
And who's the meeting guest?
I don't know, Cassie Cohen, I'm here. I put my
Oh,
name
there you
in,
go.
but maybe it didn't come through right. I don't know. Sorry
It's just
about
saying
that.
Meeting guest, but so glad you're here, Cassie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And John's here. Hi, John. It's good to see you.
Chamber.
No problem, no problem. We're just getting started. So we have an agenda that we're gonna do sort of a little bit of a recap of where we've been to date. Some of the information since September, sort of how it's all come together. But before we get started, then we'll have a conversation about industrial capacity and making up projected needs for industrial capacity. But before we go there, at the end of the last meeting, it felt like there was a lot of passion in the room. And I know there are some very passionate feelings and different perspectives, and I want to acknowledge that. I also want to just acknowledge that we invited you here for exactly that. My role, I've been letting it be more organic to date. I'm going to take a little more control of the meeting if it starts headed in that direction again, because I want us to have really constructive conversations. And most importantly, I want to make sure that BPS and the city are getting the information we need to develop the EOA. And so we'll keep headed in that direction, but I just, where we can find consensus, fantastic. Where there are differing opinions, also fantastic. But appreciate everyone, making room for one another. You all have done really well in the past. And I did ask folks who aren't specifically on the community working group to be here as observers. Setting up the working group, so we'll acknowledge that as well. And those of you online, I'll keep checking the chat. It's not everyone in the room can see the chat, so it's best to verbalize comments for those of you online so we can all enjoy it, but I'll try to help bring those in as needed. So any questions or thoughts before we launch into the content? Oh, actually, Sarah, would you mind telling us what's on the wall before we go, and then maybe we can enjoy it at a break?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, the Brady Brewer campaign several years ago decided that they would do storytelling and history and geography of the Lower Willamette, and we engaged different artists in that. And we have a gallery at Lloyd Center that we are happy to share with anybody. And it has history, it has all kinds of things in it, and meeting space, and then we also have a river center down at Green Acres. And so this is some of the art that came out of that. Last summer, an artist made the map, and it shows the historic lakes as well as the liquefaction soil and wetlands. So that's what that was. And we have that hanging in both places. So I just made a copy. And then we had Jay Wilson come, and he gave us some slides. I have more of what the earthquake. So that's just one of those. And then we made an exhibit that briefly shows a timeline of the Lower Willamette. So that's what those are. We have way more stuff than this, but this is just what I brought. And if anybody wants a copy, then I'm happy to give these, because you gave me some maps last time. I'm happy to give some maps back. So anyway.
Well, thank you. We can enjoy those at the break and afterward. Really appreciate you bringing those. And for those of you online, I'm sorry you're not here to see it, but hopefully you've been to the gallery or can find real life. So wonderful. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom to start talking about sort of how this all comes together.
Yeah,
Or
and
has come together.
yeah, I'll because it's been almost 2 months since we last met. I just wanted to go back through some of the information that we had presented beforehand as a way to set up our main discussion about expanding industrial capacity and what that means. And so I have some slides to run through just to sort of recap that. If you have questions as we go along, please ask them, and jump into it. Again, a reminder of our sort of usual, what we call a legislative process when we are bringing something that goes to the planning commission and eventually to city council. We're still in the early stages. After we wrap up our discussions with you, we'll be producing what we call a discussion draft that goes out to the public. Comments still come back to BPS. The proposed draft, when we publish that, that is the draft that goes to the planning commission. And then all the comments and testimony go to the planning commission and they get to decide or make a recommendation to council. And then finally it goes to the city council and they adopt the EOA analysis. Again, we've had, this is our 5th meeting. After setting the context, meeting 2, we did an employment forecast and talked about the buildable land inventory. We had a meeting where Daniel talked about the Columbia Corridor E-zones. We had a meeting where Jeff talked about the North Reach and floodplain and river environmental overlay zones. And now we wanted to have a conversation about what we can do to expand our industrial capacity. We know that there are other issues out there, and so we have a meeting next month. As part of an expanding industrial capacity, we wanted to talk about the Superfund because it is such an important part of what goes on in the Portland Harbor. Unfortunately, Annie Von Berg from BES, the city's lead on Superfund issues, was unavailable today. So we'll hold that conversation over to the next meeting. And we'll get into a little bit of, there's an outstanding issue policy question around tree preservation and tree planting requirements in the heavy industrial zone. So we'll talk about a little bit about what that means and what the implications there. And then we wanted to wrap up today's meeting with just a brainstorming around what other issues you have that we want to talk about through this process. And then we can get that ready for discussion.
Tom, just a technical issue. I don't think you are sharing your presentation online. Is that true? No one else is seeing that online?
That's true.
Okay.
You'll want to see this. Thank you.
Also, just a quick point, Tom, from Cassie. I think can I quickly recommend that you invite an EPA representative to give the update about Portland Harbor. The city is a potentially responsible party, one of many, and they have their own perspective, and it's better to hear it directly from EPA.
We will try.
I'm happy to connect you with someone from EPA. We talk to them all the time.
Thanks, Cassie. Okay. Now we're good.
All right, now
Yep,
we're good.
we're all good.
Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the employment forecast and especially, the sort of base forecast that we're working from that Steve went through, and focus in a little bit on the industrial sectors. And again, you'll see in the next slide why we spend so much of our time talking about in the industrial sectors, but just to give people a feel and a reminder of how we created the base forecast. We're looking at 110,000 jobs citywide. This is based on Portland's historic share of the regional forecast prepared by the State Employment Division. So Steve looks at looks at the states, what's coming out of the state on what they expect for the Portland region We look at our shares of the different sectors, our shares of you know, overall of job growth. And so that's how we arrive at this. And then, and so the industrial sectors, I would say, you know, probably 85% of the employment in our industrial areas are in these industrial sectors. There's some office jobs, there's some retail jobs, but for the most part, it is these sectors. And when we say industrial, what do we mean? Primarily, you know, we have a little bit of agriculture and mining jobs. We have a little bit of utilities, but it's these four sort of sectors. The construction sector, about a third of our construction jobs are located in the industrial areas. Think about yards where they store equipment, their offices, industrial services like equipment rental. So large land intensive uses are part of that. Most of our manufacturing jobs are in the industrial areas. Wholesale trade. Steve, what would you say is the difference between wholesale trade and warehousing?
They're very similar. In Portland, there's a lot of overlap between a lot of the harbor businesses that need a dock are categorized as wholesale trade rather than transportation and warehousing. But generally, wholesale means that there's a retailer and it's the wholesale component of that selling to businesses rather than to individual consumers. And transportation and warehousing is bigger. That's where all of the marine distribution, air distribution, et cetera, and trucking and individual distribution of area.
Somebody have a question?
Could, okay.
Does somebody online have a question?
No, I think
Okay.
that Cassie had her hand up,
Okay.
but she dropped out, so she wouldn't be coming.
Steve, just before we get to court, Steve, could you talk a little bit about when we talk about manufacturing, what are the major manufacturers in Portland?
So Portland is fairly diverse in manufacturing. The big cluster that is here is it's in metals and machinery, which also includes transportation equipment such as Portland Shift Bigger and Daimler trucks. And that's more heavy manufacturing uses that tend to require larger sites, and a lot of them are on the harbor. We have a big cluster of food manufacturing that is now a target industry of food processing, and they are more a mix of sites. A lot of what we call green cities is clean fuel and clean tech manufacturing is here, and a lot or some of the other target industry around apparel that is companies that need manufacturing space and their supply chain. A lot of industrial services and warehouses that go with them are also here. And then after that, it's just diverse. It's the biggest industrial district in the Columbia corridor in the state, and so it attracts a lot of manufacturing companies.
I was just going to ask Steve to maybe elaborate a little bit without getting off on a little tangent here about how manufacturing and warehousing how those jobs are changing. You know, so manufacturing breaks, an example, we're seeing a little more robotics come online. So some of that starts shifting into maintaining the robots. Warehousing, we're seeing a lot more active changes to the packages in the warehousing as opposed to just put the box in there and then take it out. Could you elaborate a little bit so people kind of understand how these things morph and change?
Yeah, it's always changed. It's changed a lot over the decades, mainly with, as Corky says, increasing productivity as ways of competing by producing more with the labor that we have, existing labor that we have. Partly it's from robotics, and partly it's from different types of machinery and different types of equipment that produces more and increases overall output and for a given cost. There's also a change in historically, a lot of the big manufacturers were vertically integrated. They included all of their warehouse space, all of their industrial services in one big facility. And then in the 1970s, 1980s, it shifted toward, they got rid of all of that as part of the manufacturing, and all of the warehouse space was in separate facilities and a lot of the other services. In the pandemic, there's a lot more restriction. There was a lot more constricted growth internationally, and so we had supply chain disruptions, and a lot of companies, including manufacturers, are getting more, they're wanting to have more access to regional suppliers, so more warehouse space is desired closer in. Also, retailers need more warehouse space than others, so we're seeing recent changes. And we're also seeing, it's an interesting thing too, in the last business cycle, and actually 2 business cycles, most of the distribution space was in transportation and, well, in warehousing and distribution facilities. And this time, so far with the pandemic, we're seeing a real upswing in both manufacturing, construction, and industrial service construction. So it's getting more diverse in the last 5 years.
And I think, Steve, my understanding is like manufacturing has relatively low job growth because of the automation and the increased throughput and that sort of thing, which is why in terms of the job projections, it's in there, it's still a strong base. We're sort of keeping what we have, but most of the job growth is tied to that warehousing and transportation sector.
There's also some noise in the data there too. A lot of the big manufacturers, most of the big manufacturers that are in Portland are also headquarters offices, and their jobs are counted as headquarters offices rather than manufacturing. So Evraz is an example of that. Others are similar. So the growth in the company is often in their office type of jobs, and they are categorized differently, not as manufacturing.
I see Cassie has her hand up, and Bob, and then I know we're going to talk more about jobs at the next meeting. I don't want to get too way down here, but let me get to Cassie and then Bob will come to you.
Is there a correlation with with warehousing job growth that is low wage?
Correlation between wages and warehouse jobs.
Yes, there's some, not very much. When you look at the industrial sectors generally, I also looked at it in the data in terms of industrial occupations or job types, and the big advantage of the industrial districts is that the middle wage occupations, which are job types, tend to be industrial. And the wages, the median wages and the 75th percentile wages of manufacturing production, which are the manufacturing jobs that are on the shop floor, and transportation, and they're just about the same, and as well as admin jobs in the office sector, and healthcare assistants, which are more like nursing assistants and dental assistants. So those types of middle wage jobs tend to have a very similar wage levels. There's also a big component of startup job or jobs that there's a starting pay that tends to be lower. There's a lot of turnover in the industrial occupations. So Most of the data that we look at is on the focused on the median rather than the lower 25 percentile.
Well, we have a lot of data on these middle wage jobs and sort of the career ladders. We'll pull that out again and send it out.
So maybe it's a placeholder for the next meeting, but I'm particularly interested in the Amazon and Prologis warehouses that, have eaten up most of the land, a lot of the land that we worked on in the last round of this. And I don't think anyone anticipated that we were just going to get giant Prologis warehouses across those landscapes. And I did some research online. I was actually it looked better than I actually thought it would in terms of things, wages and things. But I think that's a real important consideration. I guess it's an open-ended question, is that the kind of jobs we want? Is that the kind of situation we want, eating up the capacity that we have? Or is it something else? Is that a long-term sustainable position? So, I don't know the answer to that today, but I like that on the agenda, at least for the next one.
Yep. I think the next one for sure is it might show up a little bit as we start talking about capacity. So let's, thank you for raising that. Yes, Jeff.
Steve, I'm just wondering about employee, sort of densities of employees, because I look at that doubling of warehouse and I'm just wondering how much land, as it compares to number of employees per square foot, are they dense in relation to others? Or are they not? Because it seems like if we're going to double the capacity, if they're not dense, it takes a lot of land, a lot of buildings to get to that number. I guess I'm just wondering about the relationship with these other job sectors that are listed.
Yeah, excellent question. And it relates to Bob's question as well. We've seen a real trend in the last 20 years or so, maybe more, that manufacturing space is becoming much less job intensive, bigger sites and fewer employees, and robotics and other things that are there. And as well, a lot of the distribution space is becoming more job intensive because there are more functions, tracking, different things that go on in warehouses that didn't used to. So that gap is closed. And then Bob pointed out Amazon. That has huge job density compared to most warehouse and distribution uses. Something like 6,000. You can find data online about Amazon, but it's really hard, and it's private. It's not it's confidential, but there's a lot of jobs in those newer big warehouses like Amazon.
But they're very low wage.
Okay. Yep. We'll pick up on that too next meeting, Cassie. Thank you. Let's keep moving.
Yeah. So this is where we wound up in terms of looking at the job forecast, looking at our buildable land supply, which we'll get into a little bit more, and how if we just look at where we start today, what we have on the ground, and why we keep coming back to talking about industrial jobs is that we're planning for growth in the central city and in our neighborhood commercial areas and in our hospitals and colleges. We have a lot of capacity under our current zoning. We look at redevelopment. We have a lot of capacity in those sectors. But when we look at the industrial areas and the industrial forecast, that's where the make no change scenario is, by 2045, given the what we expect to be the demand the out there, we're sort of 400 acres short of industrial capacity to take advantage of that industrial growth opportunity.
Tom, real quick, I was under the impression that the forecast for institutional land was tighter than what I'm seeing right here. Was I just mistaken, or
No, I mean, it was last time around,
okay,
and we made some big code changes to increase the allowable density on those campuses.
Thanks.
To really sort of free up and for them to utilize more intensively their existing campuses. And that's what we did there. Unfortunately, you know, what, for the market and in industrial, there's not a lot of industrial that goes up like we can in these other sectors or other geographies. Yeah.
Cassie, your hand is up. Do you have another question?
So strange. It doesn't say it on my end that my hand is up.
Oh.
No,
that's
I
weird.
did. I mean, are we at the place where we're talking about adding issues that we want to discuss or not yet?
Not yet. We'll get there.
Okay.
We're just sort of doing a recap of what we've heard already. These are not new things, but just kind of bringing it all together here.
I just, but, yeah, so where does, the CI content fossil fuels fit under mining or what? Like in that last slide, where does the, export?
Wholesale.
Most of them are called wholesale. Like a lot of harbor businesses are called wholesale trade. And there are companies that also do retail fuel.
Because you think about, they're moving a product, right? The product comes in and then it goes out mainly by truck. Some of it goes by pipeline down to Eugene. So
And it's also a mix too. Some of them are mining. Chevron is mining. All that.
Why Chevron? Just curious.
You're not in charge of the coatings. Yeah.
yeah.
Not a perfect list.
So just moving along, you know, when we dig a little deeper, and one thing that'll come up in the conversation is around and lot sizes and especially in you know, wanting a lot of the regional industrial land conversation is about large lots and when we break down the employment capacity that we have, you know, we have a lot of smaller sites in Portland. You know, they've been broken up over time. We have smaller businesses. And so what we see here is a lot of that sort of 400 acre deficit is really the larger sites, the 10 acres and more sites. And so that becomes another factor in how we look at what is our capacity and sort of how can we address the larger site, industrial site issues.
Can you clarify the numbers on that figure? Are those acres or are those
Those-
numbers of parcels?
These are acres. Yeah, yeah. So then just a reminder that you know, is through this process, we're trying to make a coordinated policy decision. We're trying to balance the various goals that we have in the comp plan that both are about, you know, economic growth and protecting natural resources. And that's where we used it as a jumping off point to talk about the Columbia Slough E-zones that Daniel was talking about, you know, and again, in the sort of inside the red area, we have almost 7,000 acres of industrial employment. We went through, we explained some different scenarios that we have, that those are largely on sort of what resources are we protecting? How are we protecting in terms of the width of buffers around those resources? And when we look at our environmental overlay zones, we have two types. We have a conservation zone that allows some development with mitigation, and then we have a protection zone, a P zone, that doesn't allow any development. That's the core of the resource. And we had a preliminary analysis. We started by looking at that whole 6,700 acres of industrial land and what, you know, these different protection scenarios might mean in terms of how it affects the land base and the businesses. And we talked particularly about, you know, the difference between the C zone protections and the P zone protections and how those mixes play out amongst the three protection scenarios that we were looking at. We also looked at what that we then focused in on the buildable land inventory, the vacant and underutilized redevelopable land. Out of that 6,700 acres, we have just starting out of that 6,700 acres. There's about 1,000 acres of developable acres that have E-zones on it. And if we, under the different scenarios, if we expand those E-zones, what does that do to that future development capacity? And you'll see here in a moment, what we talked about is, sort of this, it's 50 acres. We would take away 50, 100, 150 acres of additional capacity. So that 400 acre deficit goes with all of these protection scenarios. We also talked a little bit about the North Reach and the floodplain protections and the need to make changes to those to be consistent with the FEMA BIOP. That's early work that Jeff is undertaking. We're not quite as dialed in terms of like we are with the E-zone mapping, but we talked about what those changes might mean in terms of, and it makes a big difference in terms of, are we talking about what we call river dependent industrial uses, the people that rely on the docks and the connection to the marine transportation on the river, that those will have different requirements, almost less requirements than say non-river dependent. You don't need to actually be there on the river. You're not utilizing the river as part of the business. And therefore, there are more requirements in terms of especially in terms of habitat mitigation along the river. We don't have sort of the same level of numbers in terms of, well, what will that impact mean both to existing businesses and future development capacity. We're working on that to come up with estimates around that. But that's part of Jeff's future project that he's working on now. So, yeah. So I put together this graphic to really talk about what we're trying to do through the EOA and to think about the EOA as a bundle of policy decisions. What kind of E-zones, what kind of floodplain protection, what kind of brownfield program, what kind of infrastructure investment. And each of those takes that capacity and it moves up and down. And so if you read this from left to right, we start off with, and these are all rounded hypothetical numbers. But you start here with the base forecast, and we were, make no change. We're about 400 acres short. We're not going to be able to grow as much industrial as jobs as we have in the past. If we add an E-zone protection scenario, that deficit might go down to 500 acres. If we come up with a floodplain, that might take it down to 600 acres. If we, and we'll get in deeper detail here, but if we had a brownfield program that helped pay for some of the cleanup costs, that would reduce the burden on development. It would reduce the barrier to development, what we call a constraint. And we would free up an existing capacity that's out there. And maybe we get 200-300 acres of that. So now we're moving in the other direction. We have a lot of land, as you will see in the industrial area, that has substandard infrastructure. It doesn't have complete streets. It lacks, some places lack sewer infrastructure. Some lack stormwater drainage. Some lack water pressure. If we invested in the infrastructure upgrades, these, especially the brownfield and infrastructure constraints are sort of right now today, it's things that cost falls on the developer. They need to pay for the cleanup. They need to pay for the infrastructure upgrades. If it's too expensive, they're going to move on to another site elsewhere in the region, outside the region, and that land will sit there. But if there are things that the city can do to help reduce those barriers, to solve some of those problems, then that site becomes more attractive for development. And I'll show you here in a minute, but so our constraint analysis discounts those barriers to development. And so as we do that, we can gain back capacity. This is the ledger, the accounting that we go through in whatever policy bundle that we come up with in the final EOA. And then, so if we did a lot of infrastructure investment, now we start getting into positive territory. Maybe we come up with a decision around tree preservation in the heavy industrial zone. Maybe that takes a little bit more away. That's sort of the process that we need to go through the EOA. The other question.
I'm just curious where shifting jobs out of the industrial area fits into something like this as well. Maybe I don't want to take us off course here, but at some point I like to hear, what about realignment of where those jobs live and the potential economic and environmental effects? Because obviously, you bring that base forecast, the need down there.
I think our approach is to work all of these issues first and see what we can squeeze out of that. And can we get into that positive territory? And if we can't, then revisiting, sort of what economic growth, what it means in Portland is part of that.
Can I clarify your question? Do you mean out of the sector or physically out of the region?
Either or potentially. Is allocating jobs to riverfront industrial necessary, or do we want to rethink that? The other comment I have is that I don't disagree with this approach. This is kind of the standard approach, all right? Policy options and which ones you should take, move things up and down. But it gets to what I was talking about several weeks ago, where we live in a theoretical realm at that point, which doesn't always translate into reality on the ground, right? And I think of it from a natural resource perspective. You can argue over E-zones and all that kind of stuff, and you're getting X number of acres. Are they quality acres? Are they the acres that matter? Are they acres where you want them? And so I always want to keep our eye on that too, because I think, especially if we get into the public forum, I think being able to transcribe this onto maps and have real discussions about, maybe you increase the E-zones, but maybe it's not all of them. Which ones actually are the most important? And I'm not giving away E-zones at this meeting. Be clear, as they're all important. These are the high benefit ones, but so on and so forth. And I think sometimes we're poorly served by arguing in these kind of theoretical realms, where it's kind of just a numbers exercise on a piece of paper to some degree. They translate to acres, but
well, and these numbers are based on what you're talking about is like actually, and I think you brought this up before, is like if it's the large sites that sort of we're really focused on, because that's where the sort of biggest rub is, then we should be taking closer looks at those and making sure that we have sort of the most accurate mapping, the most accurate assumptions. We're working with landowners. We're talking about the trade-offs of which resources are most important to protect, to sort of get that assumption around what is the impact of expanding E-zones. Where are we? What does that mean? We've had conversations, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, is, can the difference between C-zone and P-zone, conservation zone and protection zone, are there code changes to the process that can provide more certainty, that make it easier to get through the process, but provides the equivalent protection? There's a lot that we can work within sort of that column to get it the sort of most accurate, best approach that we can.
Hang on one second, Ben, let me get to Corky and I got you. Go ahead.
First of all, I agree with Bob's comment. Unfortunately, this process isn't set up for that. We've made a big I think, a good step in the right direction with this process compared to the last time we did this. What you're talking about, Bob, is a whole different process. And if we want to set this aside and work on that, I'm game. I just wanted to clarify this also, and this is kind of cool, Tom. Thank you for doing this. And I understand these are just crude numbers and but it's helpful. But I want to just clarify. So when you're talking about infrastructure improvements, there's this hypothetical or theoretical concept that we could have 500 more acres available. That's what you're saying? Okay. So,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's on a linear.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're working towards the end.
Yeah.
And this is sort of how the package that gets rolled into the EOA decision are these assumptions.
So I assume we'll talk about it down the road, but particularly where it comes to brownfield and infrastructure, I think it's gonna be really important to understand what the dollar figures are. Like both,
Yes.
because we know we're going in a time period where that money's not available. And also because particularly on infrastructure, that may end up just being a roundabout way for businesses to pay for that anyway, right? So I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what that might be. If these are the levers that we start looking at, but I agree, this is great.
Yeah. Yeah, bro.
So, bringing up Superfund and brownfields, can you help me understand, like, in an active Superfund site, what is the opportunity for brownfields? It seems like the process to get through cleanup on Superfund is required before you start bringing anything in related to brownfields. And unfortunately, and hopefully we'll change this, but that timeline is well out into the future for brownfields.
Well, we see it as, let's see. So we see them, and this doesn't actually, yeah. I don't have a good graphic here, but we sort of separate brownfields from Superfund. Superfund being the businesses in the harbor. Superfund is about cleaning up the river. The businesses that are potentially responsible parties, right? They're liable for the cleanup in the river, right? And that
also it's not just the river, it's upland as well.
Right, the banks, right? We can get into this next time about how far it extends, but basically our understanding is it's about the river pollution and the potentially responsible parties that are for that. And there's a lot of vacant and underutilized land there that not only needs to be cleaned up on the site, but is potentially responsible for the cleanup in the river. And those are big dollars. And if I, as a new industrial developer, come into that under the federal Superfund laws, if I become part of the ownership chain, I become part of the liability for that. And it's messy. And so what we have seen is new investors, new businesses are very reluctant to invest in businesses that have that potential liability. And so we'll talk about next time. One of the things that we see from an economic development perspective is that if the Superfund process can get to allocating liability for the cleanup costs, and that the EPA can start issuing what's called protective purchaser agreements for new people coming in. Like, yes, we recognize you are not responsible for the pollution and the contamination, and we're not going to hold you responsible for those costs. Then I feel safer investing in those lands. And so we see the Superfund as one set of issues. We see brownfields as more upland and outside of that Superfund area, the Columbia Corridor, that it's contaminated for other reasons. It doesn't have quite the same liability as the Superfund does. You're dealing straight with DEQ, not EPA. It still needs to be cleaned up. And when you go in to develop that site, you still need to do the cleanup, and someone's responsible for those costs. And so, so that's how we sort of split that issue.
That's how you think. Okay.
Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I would take us down a rabbit hole, and I guess somebody will be coming next month to talk to us, but I think we do need to have a better conversation around brownfields and Superfund. I mean, the PPAs, rental purchaser agreements, I don't think get us where we need to go. There are sites right now where you get PPAs, but you're still holding liability because all of those sites are cleaned up in a way that need permanent maintenance, and do come with, even with a PPA, you're not fully covered. And so I think we need to think about what role the city would play in that in terms of mitigating for that legal risk and assuming some of that potentially, not for the original polluters, but for new purchasers. And so I think there's a much more sophisticated conversation that's not happening. I've looked at some of those sites for purchase organizations that I work for, and even with the PPAs, they're still frightening sites. That's the problem. On the brownfields, I think we tried, but I also think we dropped the ball, and I think we need to think about a real strategy on that. I know when I went down to Salem and worked on some of those initiatives, I kind of got laughed out of the room. They wanted to know first line environmental repair, which I thought was weird. And secondly, there was real hostility to that in Salem, including in the governor's office, the former governor. And so we need a full court press. We need something like the downtown, thing that just went on, where we really impress upon the state that if they want economic development, we need to focus on brownfields in a different way. I was sort of shocked by how hostile Salem actually was to that. And the Metro Brownfields Initiative pretty much has gotten defunct. So I think there's a lot there, but I think, I think this round we need to think a lot deeper about what that actually means.
Yeah.
We can definitely press on that, Steve, and then Brett, and then I'm going to move us along again.
Exactly Bob's point on Rose. Tom gave a very good explanation. It was kind of complicated. It'd be good to ask that question again at the next meeting. And then the way we were looking at it for the marine industrial demand, potentially we're getting close on the remedial design. It's coming toward the end of that process and going into liability allocation, and then protection. Potentially by the second half of the forecast period, we can move a large number of those brownfields into the market, potentially. And that's a question for this group. Is that realistic? But it's a good question for next time.
Yeah. And one of my fears is I think the level of cleanup that people are being told about for uplands is not quite the reality. And so that is a level of complication that will probably take quite a while to understand and to sort of present itself.
Yeah. And to Bob's point, I think one of the advantages of the EOA, hopefully, is that we build an understanding on how all these pieces fit together and how important it is to have a brownfield cleanup program and have some public money in supporting that. And that, credit to Bob, after we did this the last time, he was right there with us trying to get a property tax abatement program, lobbying for new programs in the Salem in state legislature. And it's that kind of coalition building that you get the question like, Bob, why are you here? It's because I understand how all the pieces fit together.
I get that every time. Yeah. Why are you here when we leave?
We're glad you're here, Bob. Brett, do you have something to add?
I'm not on the committee, so I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions, but I did have a question about this, bar chart. In addition to the resource, brownfield, floodplain, there are also open space needs for this particular geography. So for sports parks that require a lot of land, is that reflected or will be reflected in this some way?
I think that is a other issue that we can talk about, and we'll put that on the list.
Okay.
When we get there.
Thank you. Great. Let's keep going.
I think we're ready to jump into the next issue. So if we wanted to take a break, this would be a short break. This would be a good time.
Good. Let's do 5. Let's do 11:05. Enjoy the artwork for those of you in the room.
Yes, this is over here. I'm gonna be in a place to get it out of everyone.
Some of that is.
What I'm doing is I'm looking at that. Just so you know what's going on right now. I walk back in.
I know it's like.
I kind of let it go for a while.
I have closed.
I walk back in. It's like, this is.
Yeah.
Everyone walks out here. So, yeah, it's super effective. So I'm thinking of. I'm really excited about it. Just on the other side. What are, you know, she said, all right, we're gonna. I feel like I'm very scattered. This is all. Raising finance. How does that impact? What I'm asking, no, basically, that's gonna result in no new direct industrial player.
What else can we do?
So the way, yeah, the way I bring it, it's like, great, if you have this. No, why wouldn't you just say? It's not, it's just. Okay. Why don't we go through all this stuff to say, here's how you can shape this plan, the super website. So we do that, let's try to make it something else, and then you can.
It's also, it's a. Let's use like, there's already, you know,
Yes.
there's a.
Well, but it's also.
Exists, okay.
But it's also important for. Somebody is depending on the lead, industrial lead. That's sort of the Bible. Let's go for office, but it comes with some.
I know, but then they're gonna get their then we bring it up. We are way off, so I don't office space now, because look at it, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, those types of projects, they're gonna care more about. You're moving.
Yes.
Seriously, like there's factors that are outside. Okay, we gotta go lower.
At least on the planet.
So it's like. I like to.
Yeah, so, but you bring up the core of the question here.
It's the indicator of time.
We have.
Sort of. So it's.
And that's.
I need to understand more. It sounds like.
And so, and then now, we have. Whatever. Where. Businesses that are seeing what they're doing or they'll figure out.
Well, I guess I was looking at different from what I have.
Yeah.
The flip side is like, we were similar, we just different. What are Portland's strengths? Labor, control. Yeah, like, you look at Portland Street, you got a lot of land. You got a lot of accommodating. Yeah. Fill that up. There's a lot more.
Right, no, I totally agree. That's a lot.
Yeah, so just where I'm thinking, I would like, you know.
I mean, other than.
Double the.
I would go with you. All right. This is the limit.
How is it?
Right.
Right now, there was. See, this is like just the. So what are the policies that we got to put in place that would be able to?
Supposed to be.
Once you have.
And that's why I don't sure. Look at that. Right. Like really got.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah, we need to think. Absolutely.
The strategy complexity looks at where we should and where we, let's try to do the job that we do with usually take the streets for. By some kind of programs and policies, right? And take advantage of for the power.
Not the.
Yeah. Well, like San Francisco wanted to go for.
Yes, I just thought I'd take, I saw you on it. My God. And then I also. Back together, please. Like.
Thanks to those of you online for your patience.
Just the people.
Okay, where are you taking us here, Tom?
Okay, so we're gonna talk now about, we want to brainstorm, what are the things that we can do to lessen these constraints and what we call expand industrial capacity. And we're really, we're not talking about rezoning or remapping, commercial areas and converting them back to industrial areas. We did a lot of that, we rezoned golf courses last time around. There's not a whole lot of opportunity within the city of Portland to sort of add new land. What we're talking about is how can we use the land that we have more efficiently? And to reduce some of these constraints. So, what we talked about and some of the things that we've talked about in the past is like, for example, if you have an environmental C zone in the industrial area, we're discounting that utility by 50% to reflect the complexity of development, the mitigation costs, all of that sort of causes the friction and reduces the development capacity of that site, that's too hard to develop, I'm moving on to the next one. And so within the buildable land inventory, we have a number of these assumptions. And, Bob brought up like, wow, you should take a closer look at the Willamette Greenway assumption, and that's something that we're doing. So we can fine tune these numbers, but basically what it means is when we look at sort of the land that we have that's currently zoned for industrial and what's available, you know, the BLI in that sort of adjusted constrained capacity is counting about 1,000 acres. But when we look at that whole inventory of vacant and underutilized land, it's this top row. We have almost 2,500 acres out there that we think could be developed in the future for industrial development. But it has these constraints. It has all of these problems, barriers to development. Within that 2,500 acres, there's probably, I think it's about 300 acres of protection zone and it's the what we call the floodway, but the actual water, right? We're not going to develop that. So that comes off the top. That leaves us about.
That's the already excluded.
From 2,500.
Yeah.
So we've taken that out, put that aside. We have 2,500 acres that right now we're saying is really only 1,000 acres of easily developable, ready to go land. That other 1,500 acres has some sort of problem with it. And that's what you see here in terms of these don't add up. They're more than 2,500 acres because lots of sites have overlapping problems. They're a brownfield and they've got a wetland on it, or they lack infrastructure. So there's a lot of overlap here. But this gives you a sense on how that breaks out, and that if we're working on an issue to sort of, you know, achieve both goals, achieve floodplain protection, but, you know, allow some development. You know, there's about 600 acres of vacant land in the floodplain. There's 900 acres that have some sort of brownfield problem with it. There's 1,300 acres, half of that 2,500 acre total has some sort of infrastructure capacity. And that's where, when we start to look at that, you know, and infrastructure, again, it's that wide range, but of transportation and sewer and water. But if we start thinking about, well, what kinds of programs could we, you know, if we had a brownfield program and, you know, currently our industrial brownfield assumption is that it's a 50% discount, then maybe we can raise that rate to 75 or 80%. We get some of that capacity back in a more developable state.
You have a question?
Yeah, just of the 1,000 you're assuming, how much of that is affiliated with some of the other that has a problem? So basically, are you splitting a site, right? Like, and you're just removing that acreage from what's available on that site? How much is affiliated, how much is like I assume like the brownfields are mostly a whole site. There's most of them are like one site that's split up. The acreage is just pulled out.
Say that again.
So you have 1,000 acres you're assuming are developable easily, right? But of that 1,000, how much of it is affiliated with any of these? Like
a lot.
One site.
I think almost every site in Portland has one.
There's no like full site that I can develop right now.
That is
now running into one of these problems.
Probably not. Yeah.
On the river,
Anywhere.
anywhere.
They have a transportation issue or a brownfield issue, something.
So the methodology you saw with like what percent we assume is developable based on the different constraints, that is taking all the sites and, you know, with all their various problems and saying, we're going to deduct 50% for this issue, 20% for that issue. So it's portions of sites, portions of a lot of sites, right, are in the mix.
Right, but I guess what I'm trying to get is you probably couldn't just buy half the site, right? So you buy the whole thing. You have some responsibility for the part.
You buy the 10 acres. here's another way to think of it. There's a 10-acre site. It has a brownfield problem on it. We're only, to recognize the added cost, the barrier to development of that brownfield, we're only counting it as 5 acres. You're still buying the 10 acre, the brownfield is everywhere, right? And so what we discounted that capacity to reflect the difficulty in developing this.
You're still buying the responsibility.
Yes, yeah. And this is the map that Sam put together. These are how all of those constraints sort of overlap each other. And so where you see the darkest red, those are the sites that have everything. That they got all kinds of problems with it. And the lighter beige and peach color are the ones that have less problems. And there's not a lot of those in Portland.
I want to be thoughtful about using the word problems. I think some of these are just.
Barrier to development.
Barriers to development. Hey, Bob, I see you have your hand up.
That's funny you said that, because I say some of those things are opportunities.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Somebody's opportunity. And not brownfield. Couple quick points. One is, I think you alluded to it, but the floodplain stuff, outside of the it doesn't restrict, it doesn't limit or prevent development. You can develop, you can mitigate for it. And so I think we should be thinking about mitigation funding for that. Well, we know we need a mitigation bank. Tom, you and I have been talking about that, I think since 2000, I think we're in our 23rd year. City keeps postponing it. So I think we need to incorporate things like that in. It's tiresome to come back to this for, I don't know, the 4th or 5th time. And we haven't done some things that are very simple that would have made our lives a lot easier a long time ago. But I also think we need to think about, if we're gonna try to take that pressure off, I think we need to think about subsidizing, not avoiding floodplain protections, both for ecological, climate, and regulatory reasons. And so I think that's where that discussion needs to go. In the Central Reach, we did waive it for folks. I think that was a big mistake. I think it's gonna back bite us badly. So I hope we go a different direction here. And then on the other side, these brownfields, I think one thing we don't talk about enough is enforcement as well. These sites were polluted by somebody. In some cases, they're orphans. In some cases, those folks are still there and they're sitting on land that they're not cleaning up. And I think if we're going to talk about incentives, we also need to talk about enforcement. How do we get some people moving on some of these sites where there are responsible parties outside the Superfund process or the DQ brownfield program? And that doesn't get enough discussion there. These things they just fell on us from God knows where, but in fact, they were polluted by somebody sometime.
I just want to say I agree with some of what Bob said. I come from a slightly different perspective, which is, and I just said this to you guys, so I'll say it to the whole group. I do think in this, it would serve all of us for the long term to just put the total cost on the table of all of these things, and then you can, within that cost, think of ways to fund it either through. We're getting lots of opinions about how you can fund it. So I just think that the end of the day, when we are done and we're successful here, would it be to the council, like, here's your total cost of all of this, right? And we got to so now we got to figure that out, right? We just have to stop kicking the can on some of these things, right? We're all victims of kicking the can that happened decades before us. I just wanted to say that last map of the 4-3-2-1, the red, dark red up to it, that was super helpful for me. I would love, is it possible to get something that's like the number, the acreage that's 4, the acreage that's 3-2-1-0, like put numbers next to that? That would be super helpful to understand, to be able to cross-reference this with the other chart you just gave us where the uses. So
You're saying on the legend?
Yeah.
Along those lines, it would be helpful if we're going to use this map, kind of work on that. If we take out the P zones, for example, Smith and Bobby Lakes, Park, you take that out and kind of go, oh, I have a different map now. It's a little more realistic. Hard. I understand why it's there, but.
Hey, if you want to just flash a similar map, I just dropped one in that's just on the thing and the BLI logs that might be more, you have to maybe out of it. You can see it black. Next slide.
Just the next slide.
It's just in that.
Oh, you put it in the slide.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
And they're messing with your slides.
It's just the very next slide.
Yeah, just.
There.
That's one.
Oh.
There you go.
See it?
There you go.
Oh.
What does this show, Sam?
This is just the, so the numbers that Tom was showing before were just on vacant lots, and BLI lots that excluded the fully constrained, P zone and floodway stuff. So this is just showing that same information just for our vacant BLI lots. So, we're removing everything across the, out of park there and just in the industrial area. So it's probably a better representation of those.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Thank you, Scott.
So we wanted to get deeper into this with you all about sort of, we've identified some things that might help reduce these barriers. We passed out this handout that Steve put together from, this is a regional issue around what we call industrial land readiness. How do you make sites ready for development so that the developer doesn't, that's going to be too hard. I'm moving on to the next site, or I'm moving on to Salem or wherever I can find a site. So these are some of the tools or the programs that Metro's identified that can be helpful to sort of activate these sites. We have a grant from Metro to do a closer look at our supply that Steve is working on, that we will be doing to sort of do some of the finer tune.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So Steve we have a grant from Metro to do.
I'm a maintenance guy and I walked into the wrong unit.
It's all right. No worries. No problem.
So we'll be taking a closer look at and getting John, as to what you're saying is what are some of the numbers to be able to do some of these programs, but we sort of wanted to open it up and learn from you and get your views on where are the opportunities. These are pretty big buckets, but is there anything from your experience or what you've seen that can help inform what we can do to sort of outline these programs, make it more real, help fine tune our assumptions, like, not having to do sewer upgrades is a big deal for us, or getting more water pressure for that food manufacturer is super helpful. I'm not sure, but we wanted to have time to just sort of have this discussion.
And we've heard a couple already, including sort of thinking about it's a little bit in the first one there, but thinking about the legal liability of future owners of sites, future developers, and sort of what that looks like. Thank you, mitigation bank. I started to write that and I forgot what I was writing.
Cassie here, I cannot raise my hand, but I would like to say something at some point here. So is now the time or later?
you.
There we go.
And Rose, to your point, I think that's sort of one of the things that the EOA process can contribute to that Superfund discussion, especially at the city level, is to demonstrate to the city why it's important that we solve the Superfund and keep working towards a resolution, is because it comes with all these economic benefits too. It's not just about cleaning up the river and, and this helps document that.
I saw it. I'm sorry. Ellen, did you? Yes, Sarah.
Well, in terms of the Superfund, my understanding is that it's going to take so long because we're looking at the life cycle of the salmon, which are one of the driving, factors for the cleanup, is to make sure that the salmon can get through the harbor as an endangered species. So just so make people understand, it's not that it would take this long if we just did it tomorrow. It's that we can only do it certain months of the year. So
that's shaking.
Yeah, that's not that's not the issue. It's really, the work windows in the river. Yeah, that's actually not the issue here with why it's gonna take.
That's what they always say at those meetings.
I'm sure that's what they say.
Yeah, they always say at the meetings that they can only work so many months of the year.
I mean, that's true, but there are other factors that are causing us to go from a cleanup that should occur in 2027 to a cleanup that's going to be 30 to 40 years.
Yeah, that I'm not saying that that's not true, but I just wanted to make sure people knew that about the window.
Yes, yes.
No, I'm not saying that there aren't other things, but I guess what I'm thinking is that there might be ways to turn some of the challenges into jobs. Like if we're not just thinking about acres, but we're thinking about jobs, then does having a wetland have an opportunity for tourism? And I think being attached to all big acreage and not trying to think like who could be on these 3-acre sites. Like I would just encourage us to think about what industry, especially along the river, used to look like. And it wasn't all 35-acre lots in any way. They were smaller, fishing or even the cleanup, they're all things that generate jobs. So I think being too rigid about, defining just 30 acres is eliminating some possibility for Portland to have jobs that we can be really proud of, that work well with the Greenway and, just brings all those things together in a really positive way. So I hate to see us eliminate the small acres.
Okay, thank you. I see, Cassie, you have your hand up.
I have a question and I have a thought as well. So my question to Bureau of Planning and Sustainability folks is, how do you explain to this group the vision from shifting to like a heavy industrial zone to mixed use zone for this proposed district from for the developments, for the I guess the property owners and the streetcar interests in the Montgomery to Hollywood project. So how do you place that in the context of this, please? And then I guess in my thinking for kind of all things future moving forward, thinking about the climate crisis, thinking about how can we come up with creative solutions. I wish there was a way for the city to be able to incentivize micro enterprise, micro manufacturing, smaller scale that is climate focused, that is clean energy focused, that can fit in these smaller spaces in the existing industrial zones that also meets the criteria for extremely good paying jobs for all of those workers that need the jobs the most. And that is open to thinking about how to design their bricks and mortar structures to integrate, green infrastructure and habitat restoration that, extends into the area of between the low and the high water mark of the river and the Columbia Slough. I mean, that's really those are the types of solutions we need, are to kind of rethink and reimagine, like, what are the possibilities to integrate industry, manufacturing, climate, solutions, good paying jobs. So two-part comment question there. So can BPS respond, please, to the first part?
Absolutely. Hi, Cassie, Patricia Diefendorfer for those who are online. So the project that Cassie's talking about is an investigation we're doing, I guess it's pretty far along, of taking some industrial acreage that's in the northwest of the city in the vicinity of Montgomery Park, and rezoning them to allow higher density mixed use. So commercial, employment uses as well, so, and housing. So that area, that study has been going on for some time. It was a federal grant in partnership with Metro. And I think the comprehensive plan, as we've talked about, in the same way that we're balancing a lot of different objectives here, the comprehensive plan also has many different objectives. Some of those objectives are to create transit-oriented mixed-use areas that support high levels of housing and jobs. So we are looking at that area because of where, its location, even though it is obviously industrial and it is adjacent to other industrial lands, it's also very close to the fabric of the city. I mean, just across Vaughan is basically the northwest neighborhood. It is, with a 0.65 mile one-way extension, so twice that for the two ways, we can very cost effectively create a mixed-use, high-intensity mixed-use area that accommodates both jobs and housing, that is connected to an extension of the streetcar at a relatively low cost for a transportation project. So it is an example of an instance where the city is, has done this study to look at, in the context of all the different policies that we're trying to promote, this area seemed like a good area to potentially do something like this. And ultimately that recommendation will go to Planning Commission and Council, and a decision will be made about that. So it doesn't change the fact that we also have a lot of comprehensive plan policies, of course, that say we want to preserve industrial land and we want industrial jobs. All of these policies kind of coexist in our comprehensive plan, and the planning work that we do in conjunction with community and stakeholders is to, make these kinds of decisions at different geographies of the city based on the context. And so that's how I would explain what's going on. Yeah.
And it's about 20 acres of land that could be converted from industrial to mixed use.
And we're doing quite a lot. I just want to add one more thing, which is the revised zoning that we're working on currently. There was a discussion draft that was out. We've been working on a revised set of zoning provisions. It does a lot to emphasize jobs as well. It's not just going to be a residential area. Montgomery Park is an existing office building that is the largest office building, I think, practically in the state. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that. And there's a lot of jobs there already. And the proposal that we're working on would continue to require a certain amount of non-residential square footage, and has a lot of provisions that are aimed at trying to make sure there's jobs in the area as the area grows, and in particular middle wage jobs. So you'll see a lot more about that that's materials will be coming out in Portland. But I don't, you know, it's not, I don't want people to think that it's just a sort of, you know, mixed use area that's maybe cafes with residential. The idea is that this is a truly more mixed employment and residential area.
There's a lot of hands up. I have a list in order. Bob, I saw if anyone has a question specific to Montgomery Park.
Yeah, I guess I mean, a little bit of a comment, but I guess I brought this up at the very first meeting. This is where I feel like the city is dropping the ball in one of the biggest opportunity areas over and over. I'll be interested in seeing what with Montgomery Park. But we know that every time you upzone industrial land, whether it was at South Waterfront, in the northwest industrial area, in the post office district, I mean, over and over again, we know that there's a cost on the other side, which is the environment. Because we get into this conversation a few years later, we have another big deficit, and now we can't put environmental regulations in. And I think there's a real disconnect in how that works. We upzone over here, and then we pay the price over here 10 years later. And we can't keep doing that. And every time I do this, Tom and I have had this conversation. He's like, well, that's water under the bridge, man. It's already done. I'm like, well, we're going to do it again. We're going to do it again.
Yes. We are talking about a relatively small number of acres here.
But it doesn't matter. It's constantly reinforcing the deficit. We never get out of the deficit, and that deficit plays out on the environment. And that's what I'm trying to get at is every time, and that's why we had the prime industrial land overlay to keep folks from upzoning, but we still seem to keep doing it regardless. And so that's a really big issue. If we want to retain industrial land, we can't keep upzoning. But I think the other big thing that's really important is, we talked about this in the first meeting too, we upzone and we don't get enough back. The people that own that property make a fortune. And from my perspective, we simply have not held them high enough standards to benefit the community. The profit margins are mammoth for the property owners, but we don't get enough for affordable housing. We don't enforce that. It's always the last thing in. We don't get the jobs. We bend all the rules for them. We just did it at city council. We just gave away a lot to developers. I think we got to make sure that if we're going to give up the jobs land and take it out of the environment, we're getting a hell of a lot more back on the flip side. And so we just don't do that. I hope you're doing it this time, but I haven't seen it happen yet in the city.
So we're trying and we're working on that, but also I know we need to, we're moving on. But I just wanted to also say that, to your point, there are other big decisions that the city that we're talking about right now that the city could be making, right? In terms of infrastructure and brownfield. So those are also big decisions that the city could be making. And all of these things need to be taken into kind of consideration alongside each other. So these 20 acres over here versus the 1,500 acres we could potentially unlock if we took certain steps, you know, we want to make sure that that is also kind of front and center in the conversation.
Land conversion is the big one in my mind. It's bigger than all these other things. And it's what's been driving this sort of petrol crisis now for 2 decades.
I'm going to thank you. Thank you. Here's my list. John, Benton, Corky, Sarah.
Take start.
Okay, Sarah's off. Great. Thank you. Go ahead, John. Thank you for waiting.
Yeah, well, first I want to say what we just did, the city council was identify a whole series of questionable high cost drivers of housing and said we're going to take pause for 5 years so that we can actually have a chance to get out of our housing deficit, which is the core driver of our homelessness problem. So that's what just happened at council. So anyway, in the spirit of other things going on, I hope this is helpful. I brought this up, but you know, many of us collaborated for the adoption of the Advanced Portland Plan, which is the city's economic development strategy. It's official policy of the city, and it identifies a whole series of industries with a climate lens that, so Prosper Portland identified these as opportunities, competitive industries for future growth, right? And so what I think would be helpful, and just so everyone knows, these are a clean industry hub in green cities, and many of us in this room are working on a clean industry hub concept. That includes, you know, we all went to Denmark and looked at how they do industrial circularity, and they locate all of their industrial businesses together so they can reduce their emissions and pipe their waste streams within each other, and so that they're, you know, providing whatever each industry needs without pumping it into the water or putting it into the air. And it's but it also needs lots of land together. Like it requires putting a whole bunch of businesses clustered. So as an aside, but it's clean industry hub, green cities, athletic and outdoor with sustainable textiles, metals and machinery, food and beverage manufacturing, software and media. It also calls for becoming a national leader in land use to protect natural amenities and to reduce suburban sprawl. So it's like right here, what the city said, yeah, we want to balance these things. We identify these industries that we want to prioritize. So what would be helpful is if we could get, I don't know if this is possible, an understanding of what to meet this goal in our economic development strategy, which was already adopted with the climate lens, which we all agreed to. What do these industries need? Like what's growth in those industries mean? Are these industries that can be tall, right? Are they more office? Are they, okay, when we talk about food manufacturing, sustainable food or sustainable textiles, what kind of, industrial land did those industries need? Like that would be extremely helpful, I think, for trying to figure out this conundrum, right? And would keep us from just doing this in sort of a general sense of like, well, we just need this much land. I would like to start with what these identified priority clusters need, and then we can, that could be an input that helps figure out the rest of this. And then I agree with Bob in some way. I just take a different lens at it, which is it's clear to me already with the numbers that we're gonna have to deal with this brownfield issue. Like we're gonna run into it at some point, right? So I just would really like to know, okay, like what is the total cost of bringing brownfield, and I'm excluding anything impacted by Superfund in this statement, up to a place where it can be developed, right? Like what does that cost? Just what is the cost? Then it's like you can look at how would we do that? Would it be through incentives? Would it be through some sort of other fund? Is it a combination of all these things? Do we ask the state for money? All the things laid out here. I just would like to know the total amount. Like instead of going to who do we require to do it? Whose job is it? Like let's understand the total cost. And then get all the levers for how we could finally get this ready for development. So that's it.
I just want to reiterate what John just said at the end, that outside of the Superfund, the understanding of the brownfield opportunity is a huge one. I do want to, there were like two comments made related to businesses in this conversation about Montgomery Park, which I think are pretty important. So, and maybe it goes into the regulatory reform permitting process piece. So in addition to the 20 acres that we're talking about there, there's an impact on a lot of businesses by adding rail, right? Like that will stay there. The industrial businesses that will stay there. When you put rail in, you take away the opportunity to have a loading truck sitting outside of it, right? And so ensuring that the permitting process is reflective of the impact on the businesses that will stay in their existing zoning based on what's actually going to happen is a really big deal. And then I would know, and that's one of the arguments we've been making. We would normally not get engaged in a conversation like this, but actually the rail aspect of it is a place where we engage.
The streetcar? When you say rail, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. And so, but so then I would take the next step kind of on Cassie's point about micro businesses. So a bunch of the businesses over there actually are small industrial businesses. So UA might be removing some of them by rezoning it or impact on. I know one of the businesses over there is like production business, right? That is mostly warehousing. And so if they can't put a loading truck inside of their business, that's a huge deal. They're having to go out of town, right? But more importantly to me is you don't have micro industrial businesses without large industrial businesses. They are the centerpiece. They're the reason why those businesses can exist in and around Portland. And so I think it's a good thing. I think it would be a really good idea to think about how we incentivize and support smaller industrial businesses filling those spaces. But understanding the sort of web that comes out from our larger businesses and figure out which are the best ones to support to would be really, really key to that. And Steve and I just had this conversation about it also enables us to maybe easily count the jobs. So like is bigger is not that dense as of an employer because we get credit for something between 700 and 800 jobs in our facility. But if we all went on a tour right now at that facility, there's over 1,300 because of all of the subcontractors that come in more civil. Right? So when we take that next step out, it's like, what does the actual market look like? And then what is the supporting small business market around it? And how do we get highly specific about supporting those businesses and what they need in these policies that we're agreeing.
Thank you.
I'm hearing a lot of agreement on stuff. Earlier, Bob mentioned something, and I pushed on this a long time ago, with our Brownfield Committee at Metro, of going after the previous polluters. That wouldn't be great. Back, I was suggesting back then that we create a bounty system, they had hire a bunch of bounty hunters, lawyers, to go after those responsible. Turns out, after we studied this for a little bit, that we actually already have that written in the law right now. It's just they're not very successful at it. The brownfield cost, John, specific to you, we looked at that very closely and we said, look, if the city's not in a very good position to do this. There's a few things the city can do, but really it's hard for the city to do it. However, the state, because of their tax income, because it could incentivize brownfield cleanup, and in general, in the industrial areas, if the state incentivized brownfield cleanup, they make that investment back in less than 10 years. In less than 10 years, and we were talking about this 10 years ago. If we'd done it 10 years ago, it'd be cleaned up and all that tax revenue to the state each year keeps coming in. Boom. It never stops. I mean, it's a golden egg. Yet we haven't been able to get the state to do that, to step up and do that to any substantial degree. So there's a lot of potential there. Just real quickly on the MP2H, what I was hearing people say was, what if we could create or incentivize small businesses, to have their industrial facilities in, we have that in the Northwest. That's what's there right now. That's why we're fighting so hard against MP2H, because that would push that out. And even if you could relocate them, you're talking about small businesses, pushing them out of the Northwest industrial area, relocate them somewhere else. And now you've got a little business that has to deal with all the regulatory problems we have that's on that sheet that you guys just handed out. It ain't gonna happen. It's not realistic. It hasn't happened yet. What makes you think that would ever happen? Yet we have that community that you were just discussing. We have it in Northwest, and we're talking about getting rid of it. It seems kind of nuts.
Rezoning doesn't get rid of it. I mean, the rezoning doesn't get rid of it. I mean,
If you rezone out of industrial and run a streetcar where trucks normally park right now, it gets rid of it. Does it get rid of all of it? No. There's some, and we can massage it and, minimize the negative impact. Still a negative impact.
You've given me some ideas to think about. So I appreciate that. I mean, one of the things I want to go back and look at now is, I think the rezoning is largely to the EX zone, which is actually a zone that allows a wide swath of use. It's everything from many different kinds of industrial, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, to residential. So I think that none of the uses that are there would be made non-conforming. They would. I understand that physically the environment might change in such a way that it would not have the conditions that they need. But there's nothing in the zoning that would.
I'm just pointing out, they heard from a couple of different people. What if we had these encouraged small businesses?
Yeah.
It's there.
And I think it could continue to be there, but I'm gonna look at that a little bit more. Yeah. I mean, ideally that we would have that kind of space.
So when we did our work on the MP2, we did a survey of companies and most of them don't want to go. But if they do go, they are going out of the city. Another economic head. Those companies are doing a lot of work with each other as well as with big companies. And when they go away, they're, I remember it's such a big deal, always talking about vehicle miles travel. We're talking about climate, but these folks are going to be commuting, adding to their commute, et cetera. So I think that that's something we need to recognize, even though it's only 20 acres. And the other piece of it is that we talked a lot about mitigation. Where are the mitigation pieces for the loss of these lands?
And we specifically asked the employees, hey, you're getting a streetcar. Wouldn't this be nice? Wouldn't this help your commute? And the reply we kept hearing back was, just give me fewer bus transfers. I don't need a streetcar. I'm not going to use it. Fewer bus transfers, I could use it.
All right, I'm gonna bring us back because we are We have about 10 minutes to continue this conversation if you all have more ideas. But expanding economic opportunities, I'm not discounting everything that was just said, by the way. Sorry, that was a hard transition. But I want to make sure that we're getting all the ideas on the table. There's been quite a few. One thing that hasn't been discussed, maybe for a reason, that's on the list, that the starting list that Tom put here, or Tom and team, is the regulatory reform, sort of non-conforming upgrades. You might want to say more about some regulatory reform that might increase capacity.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we've heard in this room and in other forums about how difficult it is to get through the permitting process in Portland. We're currently consolidating all of the permitting functions into one agency. I talked a little bit about some of the code work and trying to provide more certainty and less discretionary review, faster reviews. And I think the two things around this that we've heard of is around the E-zones and the River Greenway, and especially looking at the discretionary, what we call the discretionary review. Like, okay, I'm going to do this study. I don't know what I'm going to get into. And so making that more predictable, more certain. Non-conforming upgrades, that's where you have an older building. We've changed the code, we've changed the standards. You go to do an upgrade, and we say, oh, great. Now you have to do bike parking and parking lot trees, and all of these other, bring it up to code, right? And we've over time we've established a limit. I think it's like, I want to say you have to, depends on the value of your project. There's a cap on the cost, but there are some things that we can look at around these, what we call these non-conforming upgrades. How much are you going to have to bring your site up to the current code that we could look at to do that over time, right? To sort of make it easier or encourage the redevelopment, reuse of existing sites that are out there. That's sort of the ideas that we're aware of within that regulatory reform. Again, learning from you all as to what do people keep getting tripped by and or giving up. Yeah.
I just wanted to, another thing that we have heard is sort of this relationship between Superfund mitigation, et cetera, state, federal regulations and city regulations. So that's another thing we're looking at in terms of how do we account for things that have already been done, still ensure that we're meeting our regulations, but sort of not duplicating requirements and things like that. I think we tend to try to do that, but we'll look at that as well. For that's another concern.
But John, I see you have your hand up. I'm going to get to you. Kara, I'm not going to come to you right away, but I'm wondering if you might chime in. And I'm just pointing it out, like some of you who are doing development who run across this kind of permitting issue, I'd like to know, we would like to know, how much is this an issue? How much do you think regulatory reform will advance?
Yeah, absolutely. We're currently working on a couple different projects in what is still Northwest Industrial, so not the area that we were talking about by Montgomery Park, but just a little bit further into Gilds Lake. And it's such a time related process in a lot of different ways with the greenways and things like that. Now, I think that there's validity to many of the requirements, though I just want to state that. But for the amount of time that approvals might take, or how the city might look at a site, maybe it's 2 parcels, but they want to consider it one, even though there could be 2 things going on it, and the requirements from that, especially, with outfall and things like that for the river. Just the time it takes literally just killed what would be a redevelopment of 900,000 square feet old building into a newer, 2 buildings that would have been 500,000 square feet. And, that part of that was some of the time that it took to try to figure out some of the process with the city. There's another project that this was kind of spoken about earlier, where there's just so much ambiguity onto what future requirements and the liabilities in certain parts of the river and the outfalls for certain areas, even though a group may not be a known contributor, or they're not on the known contributor list. That process has been really hard to transfer properties because there isn't necessarily a known environmental issue on a property, but there could be the future of liability. So that's also kind of taken what I think really should be a good focus. I mean, absolutely, I would love to see, you know, more industrial land be put into use, but the redevelopment of existing land, existing properties that might have buildings on them that could be retrofitted or torn down and put back up, that really seems like it should be a good focus, some of that infill development. So it's not necessarily taking down, you know, additional parcels, and that feels like the low hanging fruit. But we had one group that was looking at converting a building into a multi-tenanted building that had been just 100,000 square foot building. And when they looked at what they were going to be required to do by code, they terminated the transaction. That one was coupled with, you know, potential future liability on a site that is not listed as a known contributor. So there's just a lot of things, especially in that Northwest area, that are working against maximizing the industrial land that we have.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot.
Yeah, no worries.
Go ahead, John.
I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. And I apologize. I should have said earlier, I think this is a great list. The only one I feel like my perspective at this moment, and those comments have really helped me, is that just Superfund just seems like such a gargantuan thing. Like that's the only thing I would take off this list that seems like it's gonna have to be done with some.
Well, but I think that maybe change that to focusing on carving out the upland.
Yes, yeah. Understanding, I think, what our limits are on that issue as well. Okay, on the code you just asked, Tom, 100%, getting that permitting process, getting the consolidation done is by far the most important thing. And I want to just recognize Christine and Shirley's office for getting it done. Like the biggest driver now was how long it took, and then the uncertainty of going from bureau to bureau to bureau and having one bureau force you to start over after you've gotten through. When getting it all done once, getting that done as quick as possible is priority number one, and just grateful that that's happening. On the code, I think we have a model that Christina just ran that we just did with housing that's a worthwhile exercise to identify all of the code requirements, survey, you know, the industry about it, actually do a cost analysis on it, and then have a conversation about balancing that with our values. I think we could do a similar thing that the Housing Bureau and PPS just did on housing, and do that for this. I think it would absolutely be a worthwhile process for us to go through. We would most likely identify some opportunities for reducing costs that, and you know, it won't be a panacea, but it's definitely worthwhile to do. And the process that this Bureau and Housing Bureau ran housing was really good.
And maybe reducing some of the complexities that Karen's.
Yeah, you know, all of the things, right? So, yeah.
Other thoughts about regulatory reform as an opportunity? Oh, I'm sorry, Benton, I didn't see her.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I would agree with the, let's not get in the way of the process that's happening. I think it's like the consolidation process is a big deal. We agree with it. I mean, I was trying to go through my email because you like to get a permit to put in just storage racking in the middle of our facility on Swan Island early last year, and it took 10 months to get to. And people were like, what is taking so long? And the questions were basically, what is the impact on the river? And we're like, well, it's like 100 yards from the river. So like it's just 2-level racking next to our tank. So the questions were good ones. It's just why does that process take so long? So like, that's a big thing. I actually wanted to ask a question, which was, have you been getting it coming about this sewer stormwater infrastructure question? Because this is obviously an issue that has just recently come up at council. So I'm just wondering if that's something that you've heard feedback about already, and whether people are asking for changes.
You just elaborate on what's happening in council.
Well, then we just have the stormwater rate fee issue, which and the reason why it's going to be relevant to the infrastructure upgrade piece, because the sticking point was a bunch of river businesses saying, don't bill us for this because we foot the bill already. We do this on our own, right? And so, that's why I was wondering if there's any of us on the record who are coming with something different. I mean, our joke internally was if the city would like to buy our stormwater infrastructure, have at it, like, I'm not gonna get do the 10 million a year or whatever it costs us to maintain it, but so that's why I was wondering if there's some other thing at play.
No, we've worked with Bureau of Environmental Services to identify parts of town that lack stormwater infrastructure or lack even sewer pipes that we know will need to be extended to serve a site.
Okay. So new infrastructure, basically.
Yeah.
We will continue brainstorming again next meeting with new information that we also get at the next meeting. But before we transition to what other issues to discuss, are there last ideas or thoughts you have on your mind right now? Sure.
I guess just a thought is when we talk about, different things that we do to encourage the economy, I think sometimes when I read stuff, there's a difference between the owner and how much money they're making. So most of these benefits go to the owner, but not necessarily to the people that are working there. And like you could go down and you can just go to a business and someone might say, I'm making $14 an hour to work at a business. And then if you look online, the head person makes a couple billion a year. So I just want to be careful when we talk about what economy we are supporting. And some of the businesses aren't even headquartered in Oregon. They're making millions out of state, or they may have a headquarters here, but many of their businesses are not in the state and certainly not in the city. So I just want us to be aware of the income disparities that sometimes seem to exist with some of these businesses.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk more about jobs too next time as well. So I'm ready to transition us to other topics. We got this handout. Do folks online have this, Sam? Or this?
Good question. I'll drop it.
Thank you. Those online, Sam's gonna put in the chat a little cheat sheet we have, but
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, what we just handed out were sort of our compilation of what we've heard in the previous meetings as to like follow-up questions, bring more information. We're working on this, to bring it back to you. As I said at the beginning, that there's other sort of big topics that we want to talk about that we know. I talked a little bit about the tree preservation, tree planting requirements in the heavy industrial zones. We had on our list the Portland Harbor Superfund and liability and the natural resources damages mitigation. Time to time, we've heard about recreation access to the river. Brett Porter from Parks had to leave, but they have on their their list of issues is that as we grow as a community, Delta Park, the soccer ball field complex is sort of at its maximum. They recognize a need for another one. Where are you going to find 20, 30 acres of flat site that can be another sports field complex? And that's likely to land somewhere in the industrial area that obviously is not going to be an industrial job business. So that, sort of comes off the ledger in the other direction, so to speak. But we wanted to give an opportunity. So we're working on bringing those issues to this group. We wanted to hear from you as to, we heard a little bit from Bob about sort of the nature of those warehouse and distribution jobs that we can compile some information on. But what else is out there? What are you thinking about when you hear this discussion? Like, I want to know how this works, or what are we doing about whatever issue is out there. Sort of give you an opportunity to put more things on the list, so to speak.
We just want the Greenway Trail to list.
Industrial land use issues. Things you've heard percolating on the low.
I have a question about the Portland Harbor Superfund Natural Resource Damages Mitigation. I don't understand. So
One of the things like the mitigation banks. The mitigation banks that are at like the Linton Plywood site and the PGE site. The Linton Plywood site could have been a plywood manufacturing facility, but it got converted to a mitigation bank. It supports sort of the both Superfund and other stuff. And we talked earlier about the need for floodplain mitigation banks, but that if that happens in Portland, in the Portland Harbor area, then that reduces the opportunity, the industrial capacity or that industrial opportunity. So we just knew also that I think Cassie had asked to make sure that we incorporate when we talk about the Portland Harbor Superfund issues to focus. There was a natural resources damages agreement.
it's a partial settlement.
Partial settlement, right.
Trustees, yeah.
Right, so to bring some information back about what is that, how does that affect the businesses, how does that affect? And it is a partial settlement, so there's more out there. How are we thinking about that? How should we account for that in this process or not? That's just that sort of what's embedded in that issue.
We've had a lot of discussion today, forgive me, clients, about brownfields. I'm wondering if that's something that needs a little more exploration and future conversations. I've heard questions about assumptions being made about what's the scope of the brownfield issue.
I think we're hearing, what's the cost of cleanup?
And what's the potential?
What's the potential benefit?
Yeah.
I also, I think a takeaway is John's comments about looking at the advanced Portland sectors, priority sectors that have already been identified and thinking about their space needs and their land needs and how, where there are linkages to the conversations we're having here. What does that do to inform how we're thinking about the EOA?
So we have some prepared questions that I think we just want to like throw out there with. So one is, tell us how these new regulations will interface with the existing greenway or tree code requirements. Will they be the same for required maintenance project as a new project like yard expansion in the North Reach? Okay, thank you. Second question is, how do these regulations compare with those imposed in the Central and South Reach of the city? Okay. Third question is, have you looked at how these might impact a specific site and how has that been factored into the total industrial acreage impacted? And why would that not constitute a taking? And then 4 is, it seems like we are getting further behind in meeting employment and equity goals with these additional requirements. What is BPS able to do that is under BPS authority to address further loss of industrial development opportunities? And then the last one is, how do you plan to share information about the proposed new E-zone and balance cut and fill requirements with individual landowners?
A list of questions?
Thank you.
So actually just, you guys said my comment, which is like at the end of this process, how do we square whatever decision we make and the impact it might have on the trajectory of jobs with the advanced Portland plan, with the state law. And And with our own projections, because I think one thing that didn't get, it wasn't a column for a percentage of the economy on Steve's thing, but it was like the future growth is industrial sector is at 30%, growing up 30%, and it's growing faster than the rest of the economy, right? So how do we square any decision that limits that data, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be critically important. And then I have my second question is, and I'm going to just say our dumb question, but when we look at the land inventory across all of the economic sectors, and all of the other ones are more than 200% of the. Why is the conversation that we are having about how to manage industrial land as it exists today and like come up with new industrial land when we have double the land capacity in these other areas? Why is the conversation not about looking at those other areas for potential growth in industrial?
That's fair. We have done some stuff in the past, like when we wrote our mixed use zones, we increased the allocation for light industrial assembly uses to try and create, obviously the smaller spaces. Patricia mentioned the EX zone that you actually can do pretty much all of the industrial. The issue there with going sort of converting back has to do more with the finance, right? And in the EX zone, office, well, it used to be offices, but residential development can afford to pay higher rents, higher prices than industrial.
Yeah, to some degree.
Yeah, pricing.
Yeah, to some degree, but that in the past, the economics have worked such that even if it's allowed, you have other people outbidding those more industrial type users for that.
I guess I would just throw in, we're having a conversation about what is sure to be an extremely high cost of redeveloping brownfields.
Yeah.
It would seem that we should explore the high cost, the other potential cost of supporting the return of that land to industrial, right?
Yeah, and I want to echo that. That's what I was getting at earlier. And you're absolutely right. It's a one-way street, unfortunately. It goes natural area, industrial, commercial, residential. And I don't think this study tracks enough as we move through each one of those. And I also, I think the industrial community needs to show up more too. I mean, I know in the post office district, I was the only one there raising industrial uses over and over again. I was alone, and no one wanted to have that discussion because there was way too much money to be made on that. And the city had control and they gave it away. And commercial is different than industrial. And, if you zone it hard industrial, it's going to have to be industrial. And if you zone it something else and hope for jobs, maybe good luck, we'll see. So that's really what I'm trying to get at. If we're going to do these things, I think both on the industrial side and on the housing side, we need to be much more stringent. What we do is we leave a ton of flexibility for developers to do what they want. And that becomes about profits rather than community needs.
I just want to note that Bob and I and Torquay and we all agreed more in this meeting.
Very much consensus and coalition of thinking here. Thank you for acknowledging that.
Not an intentional coalition.
Gosh, no, never.
No. I don't know if this is useful, but it occurs to me that we haven't really talked much about traded sector. For example, today we talked a lot about jobs, and we can talk about jobs more next time. But the fact that the traded sector is very important to our local economy, I think is something that perhaps is useful. I'll leave it to you guys to decide. If we are talking about the EX zoning, for example, as we've talked about a little bit here, we've got an example in Southeast where we applied EX zoning, and we could look at that and say, okay, what's happened to industrial use in Southeast? What have been the advantages and disadvantages of it? And if you're going to do that, again, Northwest is a good example too, and Bob's spot on. Go look at the ownership of the parcels in Northwest. Once people started talking about doing streetcar, people bought up some parcels. Why? What are they thinking? Well, they're speculators, they're land speculators, and I don't begrudge that. If they want to do that, fine, but Bob's absolutely right. If they're going to do that, we should be extracting value out for the employees of the city as it happens. John may be hating me for this, but yes, no. So you can look at the southeast and find what's happened there. You can look at Northwest in terms of the property ownership and see what's evolving there. And it's kind of interesting. But it's way deep.
Additional thoughts? Okay. Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on Kevin's comment that I thought was really good on conversion. And Tom explained that it's really hard after industrial land has already been rezoned to commercial. But we still have this issue of we've lost about 2 million square foot of industrial space in the commercial areas in the last business cycle. So the conversion is an ongoing process. It's interesting, if you look at this Metro toolkit, how they're addressing it, they're not really talking about moving it back, but code requirement or easing code requirements that make it very difficult for existing industry to stay, so that they can put a new roof on their building and they can do things and not have to pay double for it and not have to do a variety of other things that take much longer, that have a big push impact for existing industry that's in there. So it slows down that process for, say, the existing industry that's still in the Pearl District and surrounding the central city. That was the new tool that was emphasized there. So there are a variety of ways that potentially could address incentives for that issue.
Any other, those of you online, any additional topics you'd like to discuss? We have a long list here, but I don't want to miss it.
Yeah, just real quick, one item that, has come up a little bit, and this might sound a little scattered, but, it is important to put industrial users in an area where they're going to be allowed to do their industry. So neighbors that are, residential neighbors aren't the best for industrial, as we know. So I just kind of wanted to point that out as to why can't we take some of this other general commercial or residential land and convert it to industrial? It's, who your neighbor is going to affect the ability for you to do what you need to on your land. So that was one thing. And then just another component, I know it's easy to say that, you don't want any warehousing and transportation, but for these smaller groups that everybody agrees that we want to keep around, they're going to require raw goods. They're going to require finished goods to be stored and things of that nature. So I think it's important to also understand the ecosystem of some of this industrial development, and that you do need to have warehouse and distribution uses close to your manufacturers, regardless of their size. So just something I kind of wanted to note.
Thanks, Kara. And then Cassie, I think I heard you speak up. Is that right?
Oh, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Anyone else has thoughts, or I'll get 12 minutes of your life back? Do you have last thoughts?
No, this was good. We put, I think Sam sent out a February 23rd meeting invite to come back, and we'll compile some information around these issues as keep the conversation going. Thank you all for your time.
Got there. Thank you, those online. And it started.
Well, then I have fun. You're still doing, not